The pre-dawn darkness of September 26, 1918, hung thick over the Argonne forest like a shroud waiting to be lifted. Lieutenant Colonel George Patton crouched in his muddy trench, watching the luminous hands of his pocket. Watch crawl toward 5:30. Less than an hour. The largest American offensive in history would begin, and with it, the final act of the Great War would unfold. The silence was deceptive. Behind the American lines, over 4,000 artillery pieces stood ready to unleash hell upon the German positions. General John Pershing had spent months planning this moment, refusing to allow his American expeditionary forces to be parceled out among French and British units. This would be America's battle, fought on America's terms. With American blood spilling for American victory, Captain, Eddie Rickenbacker adjusted his flight goggles and checked his ammunition one final time. Spad fighter sat ready on the makeshift airfield, part of the largest aerial armada ever assembled by American forces. The ace pilot had already claimed 22 enemy aircraft, but today would test even his legendary skills. The German Air Force, though weakened, remained a formidable opponent over their own territory. In the German trenches across no man's land, Oberst Heinrich Müller peered through the morning mist with growing unease. Intelligence reports had warned of American preparations, but the scale of what was coming remained hidden in the fog. His soldiers, many barely 18 years old, clutched their rifles with hands that trembled from cold and fear. The German war machine that had terrorized Europe for 4 years was running on fumes. Held together by discipline and desperation, the Argonne forest stretched before them like a primeval nightmare, its ancient trees twisted into natural fortifications that the Germans had spent 4 years perfecting. Concrete bunkers nestled among the roots, machine gun nests commanded every clearing, and barbed wire snaked through the undergrowth like metallic thorns. This was not merely a battlefield. It was a fortress carved from the earth itself. According to military historian David Kennedy's comprehensive analysis in Over Here, The First World War in American Society, the Meuse sector represented the strongest German defensive position on the Western Front, with multiple lines of trenches extending back nearly 20 miles. As the minutes ticked away, American soldiers whispered prayers in a dozen languages. Irish immigrants from Boston stood beside Italian farmers from New Jersey. German Americans wrestled with the irony of fighting their ancestral homeland. And African American soldiers prepared to prove their valor in a war that questioned their citizenship at home. They were united now by mud, fear, and a shared determination to end this war that had consumed a generation. The forest itself seemed to hold its breath. Ancient oaks that had witnessed countless battles throughout history stood sentinel over this latest human folly. Somewhere in the mist, a nightingale sang its final song before dawn, unaware that it serenaded the prelude to one of history's most decisive battles. At exactly 5:30, the world exploded. The American artillery barrage began with a sound that defied description. 4,000 guns firing simultaneously created not merely noise, but a physical force that shook the ground for miles in every direction. Soldiers on both sides pressed their hands to their ears and opened their mouths to prevent their eardrums from bursting. The very air seemed to tear apart as shells screamed overhead toward German positions. Lieutenant William Mitchell, commanding the American Air Forces, watched from his observation post as the forest erupted in flame and smoke. His pilots were already airborne, their engines barely audible over the thunderous barrage. The plan was ambitious: achieve air superiority while the artillery pounded German defenses, then provide close support as the infantry advanced through the devastated landscape in the German command bunker. General Max von Gallwitz received frantic telephone reports from his forward positions. The lines crackled with static and terror as officers described an apocalypse descending upon their trenches. Entire sections of the defensive line simply vanished under the concentrated fire. Von Gallwitz, a veteran of countless battles, had never witnessed such overwhelming firepower. The bombardment continued for 3 hours, each minute stretching into eternity for the men cowering in their holes. American shells targeted not only the front lines, but the entire depth of the German defensive system. Supply lines, communication networks, artillery positions, and reserve trenches all came under devastating fire.
Ow.
The Germans had faced Allied barrages before, but nothing approaching this scale and intensity. Private James Murphy of the 77th Division hugged his rifle and waited for the signal to advance. The Irish-born soldier had left his job in a New York steel mill to fight in France, driven by stories of German atrocities and a desire to prove his American loyalty. Crouched in a trench that reeked of cordite and fear, he wondered if he would live to see another sunrise. The Argonne forest began to change under the relentless bombardment. Ancient trees, some standing for centuries, toppled like matchsticks. The carefully constructed German defensive positions, built with Teutonic precision over 4 years, crumbled under the weight of high explosive shells. Concrete bunkers that had seemed impregnable became tomb-like death traps as their roofs collapsed. Captain Harry Truman, commanding Battery D of the 129th Field Artillery, adjusted his gun's elevation for the 100th time. The future President of the United States was learning leadership in the crucible of combat, making split-second decisions that would determine whether his fellow Americans lived or died. Missouri farm boy practicality served him well. The chaos of modern warfare, as documented in the official U.S. Army history, the last offensive, by the Army's Historical Division. The preliminary barrage fired over 1 million shells in the first 3 hours, more ammunition than the Union Army had used during the entire Civil War. German counter-battery fire began to respond, but it was sporadic and ineffective. The German artillery, undermanned and running low on shells, could barely respond to the overwhelming American firepower. Many German guns had been withdrawn to protect the fatherland from expected Allied invasions, leaving the Western Front dangerously vulnerable. At 8:30, the barrage lifted with almost supernatural suddenness. The silence that followed seemed more deafening than the noise that had preceded it. In that moment of eerie quiet, whistles began to blow along the American lines. The infantry assault was beginning. The whistle blasts pierced the sudden silence. Like banshee screams, and 26 American divisions rose from their trenches as one. Over 600,000 men advanced across no man's land toward the shattered German positions, the largest single assault in American military history. The sight was both magnificent and terrible, a human tide flowing across the scarred landscape toward an uncertain fate. Sergeant Alvin York of the 82nd Airborne Division moved forward with his Tennessee mountain man's steady gait, keen hunter's eyes scanning the devastated terrain ahead. The future Medal of Honor recipient carried his rifle with the casual competence of a man born to the weapon. But even his backwoods experience could not have prepared him for the industrial slaughter he was about to witness. The German response was swift and deadly. Machine guns that had survived the barrage opened fire from concealed positions, their chattering death songs cutting down Americans by the dozens. The Spandau machine guns, firing at 600 rounds per minute, created overlapping fields, a fire that turned the forest clearings into killing zones. Yet still the Americans came forward. Stepping over their fallen comrades with grim determination, Major Charles Whittlesey led his lost battalion through the tangled undergrowth,
Where?
that he was walking into a trap that would make his unit famous. The forest paths, barely visible under normal circumstances, had been obliterated by the bombardment. His men navigated by compass and instinct through a landscape that resembled the surface of an alien planet. The German defenders, those who had survived the barrage, fought with the desperation of cornered animals. Young soldiers who had never seen their homeland except in faded photographs knew that every yard yielded might be a yard closer to their family's destruction. They had been told that American soldiers took no prisoners, that surrender meant torture and death. Captain Eddie Rickenbacker's Spad fighter screamed through the sky above the battlefield, engaging German Albatross fighters in deadly aerial duels while the infantry struggled below. The sky war was no less brutal than the ground combat, with pilots burning alive in their canvas coffins or plummeting to earth with wings shot away. Rickenbacker's marksmanship and flying skill kept him alive through encounters that claimed lesser pilots. The first German defensive line fell within hours, but at a terrible cost. American casualties mounted as the survivors pressed deeper into the forest. where every tree might hide a sniper and every shadow could conceal a machine gun nest. The wounded cried out in a dozen languages, their voices creating a hellish chorus that echoed through the smoke-filled woods. Colonel George Patton led his tank corps through the devastated landscape, his primitive armored vehicles crushing obstacles and inspiring the infantry to follow. The tanks were mechanical marvels barely worthy of the name, more likely to break down than to be destroyed by enemy fire, but their psychological impact was enormous. German soldiers who had never seen these steel monsters often fled at their approach. According to historian Edward Kaufman's The War to End All Wars, American casualties in the first day reached nearly 14,000, but German losses were even higher as entire companies were wiped out by the overwhelming assault. The advance continued through the afternoon, with Americans gaining ground measured in hundreds of yards rather than miles. Each German strongpoint required its own small battle, with flanking movements through the treacherous forest undergrowth and close-quarters combat that favored neither side. The training camps of America had not prepared these men for this type of warfare. As darkness fell on September 26th, the first day of the offensive had achieved its primary objectives. The outer German defenses were broken, and American forces held positions that had seemed impregnable just hours before. But the real test lay ahead, so the Germans would undoubtedly counterattack with reserves held in the rear areas. The Forest of Death dawn on September 27th revealed the true horror of modern warfare. The Argonne forest had been transformed overnight into a landscape that defied imagination. Shell craters filled with stagnant water reflected the gray sky like dead eyes, while the remains of once mighty trees jutted from the earth like broken bones. The sweet smell of gas mixed with the stench of death, creating an atmosphere that seemed to poison the very air. Major Charles Whittlesey and his lost battalion pressed deeper into the forest, following orders that would soon prove disastrously outdated. The communication lines back to headquarters had been severed by German artillery, leaving the unit isolated in enemy territory without support or supplies. The dense canopy above blocked visual signals, and radio technology remained too primitive for reliable battlefield communication. German Oberst Heinrich Müller organized his reserves for a counterattack designed to trap the advancing Americans. In a deadly pocket, his men, though outnumbered, possessed intimate knowledge of every path and hiding place in the forest. They had spent 4 years turning this ancient woodland into a fortress, and they intended to make the Americans pay for every yard in blood. The second day's fighting took on a different character as the initial shock of the assault wore off, and both sides settled into the grim business of close-quarters combat. American soldiers found themselves fighting not a conventional battle, but a deadly game of hide-and-seek among the twisted trees and broken undergrowth. Every advance required clearing bunkers, eliminating snipers, and neutralizing machine gun nests hidden in positions that seemed impossible to assault. Sergeant Alvin York's moment of destiny approached as his patrol encountered a German machine gun position that commanded a crucial forest clearing. The Tennessee marksman's hunting instincts served him well as he systematically eliminated the gun crew with precise rifle fire. But the action that would make him famous was yet to come. The German defenders, recognizing his deadly accuracy, began to concentrate their fire on his position captain. Harry Truman's artillery battery struggled to provide support to the advancing infantry. The forest canopy made observation nearly impossible, and the fluid nature of the battle meant that friendly forces might be anywhere in the target area. Artillery officers found themselves making split-second decisions based on incomplete information, knowing that a mistake could mean killing their own men. The German response grew more desperate as the day progressed. Stormtroopers, elite German assault units launched fierce counterattacks designed to break the American advance and rescue isolated strongpoints. These battles often degenerated into hand-to-hand combat with bayonets, trenching tools, and bare hands as the primary weapons. Lieutenant Colonel George Patton learned the hard way that tank warfare in dense forest was more theoretical than practical. His armored vehicles, already primitive by later standards, became nearly useless in the tangled undergrowth. Several tanks became hopelessly bogged down in shell craters, their crews forced to abandon them and fight as infantry. recorded in the comprehensive official history of the American Expeditionary Forces compiled by the U.S. War Department. The second day of fighting saw American units scattered across a front that stretched for 25 miles, with some units advancing several miles while others remained pinned down by fierce German resistance. The afternoon brought news that chilled American commanders. Major Whittlesey's battalion had become completely surrounded by German forces. The unit, consisting of over 500 men from New York and New England, was trapped in a small valley with no apparent means of escape. German forces controlled all the high ground around their position, making relief attempts extremely hazardous. Captain Eddie Rickenbacker's aerial reconnaissance revealed the true extent of the tactical situation. From the air, he could see German reinforcements moving up through concealed forest paths, while American units remained scattered and often lost in the maze of broken trees and shell holes. The battle was developing into exactly the type of attritional nightmare that American commanders had hoped to avoid. As night fell on the second day, both sides prepared for what they knew would be an even more desperate struggle on the morrow. October 1st, 1918, marked the sixth day of the offensive and the beginning of what would become the most famous individual action of the entire battle. Sergeant Alvin York, leading a patrol tasked with silencing German machine guns that had pinned down an entire American company, found himself in a situation that would transform a Tennessee mountain man into a national legend. The patrol had successfully captured a German officer and several enlisted men when machine gun fire from concealed positions cut down half of York's men in seconds. The remaining Americans took cover behind fallen logs while bullets whined overhead like angry hornets. York, drawing on his hunting experience in the Tennessee mountains, began systematically picking off the German machine gunners with his rifle. Major Charles Whittlesey's lost battalion entered its fourth day of encirclement, their ammunition running low and their food supplies exhausted. German forces had tightened the noose around the trapped Americans, launching periodic attacks designed to eliminate the pocket of resistance. The major maintained discipline among his men through a combination of personal courage and quiet determination that inspired even the most frightened soldiers. The German attacks on the lost battalion grew more sophisticated as Oberst Müller brought up additional troops and artillery. The Americans found themselves subjected to constant harassment from snipers, periodic gas attacks, and concentrated mortar barrages. Several attempts to break out had failed with heavy casualties, leaving the survivors more determined but increasingly desperate. Captain Eddie Rickenbacker scored his most spectacular victory of the war when he encountered a formation of German reconnaissance aircraft over the battle zone. Flying alone against superior numbers, the American ace shot down 2 enemy planes in a single engagement, bringing his total to 24 confirmed victories. His reports of German reinforcements moving toward the lost battalion proved crucial for planning relief operations. York's action reached its climax when a German officer led a bayonet charge against his position. The Tennessee sergeant dropped 6 charging Germans with his pistol, shooting them in reverse order so the others would continue forward rather than taking cover. When the smoke cleared, York had single-handedly captured 132 German prisoners and silenced 35 machine guns. The relief of the lost battalion became a race against time as American commanders realized that the surrounded unit was running out of ammunition and medical supplies. Multiple rescue attempts failed as German defenders turned every approach into a killing zone. The Americans tried everything from direct assault to infiltration tactics, but the German positions seemed impregnable. Lieutenant Colonel George Patton received word that his tank units would spearhead the relief effort. Despite the obvious difficulties of armored warfare in dense forest, his crews worked frantically to prepare their machines for what everyone knew would be a desperate gamble. Many of the tanks were already showing signs of mechanical wear, and replacement parts were scarce. The battle's intensity reached new heights, as both sides committed their reserves to what had become a struggle for national prestige as much as tactical advantage. American newspapers had begun following the lost battalion story, making their rescue a matter of national honor. German commanders understood that allowing a surrounded enemy unit to escape would damage morale across their entire front. According To military historian Russell Weagley's The American Way of War. The actions during this phase of the battle demonstrated both the courage and the tactical inexperience of American forces. As individual heroism often compensated for institutional shortcomings in training and doctrine, October 7th brought the breakthrough that American commanders had been desperately seeking. A coordinated attack by the 77th Division finally broke through German lines and reached Whittlesey's position. The survivors of the lost battalion, reduced to fewer than 200 effectives, were finally evacuated after holding their position for 5 days. Against overwhelming odds, Sergeant York's capture of over 100 German soldiers with a patrol that had been reduced to 7 effectives became the most celebrated individual action of the war. His combination of marksmanship, skill, and tactical intelligence represented the best qualities of the American soldier, earning him promotion and the Medal of Honor. By mid-October 1918, the German defensive system in the Argonne was showing signs of irreversible collapse. What had begun as a carefully planned withdrawal to secondary positions had deteriorated into a fighting retreat that consumed German reserves faster than they could be replaced. The American pressure was relentless, with fresh divisions rotating into battle as exhausted units were pulled back to rest and refit. General Max von Gallwitz faced an impossible situation. His intelligence officers reported American strength at over 1 million men, with reserves still arriving from across the Atlantic. Meanwhile, his own forces were melting away through casualties, desertion, and the simple exhaustion that came from fighting a technologically superior enemy. The German war machine was running out of both men and materials. Captain Harry Truman's artillery battery had become expert at providing close support to advancing infantry, a skill learned through bitter experience and measured in American lives. His Missouri farmers and mechanics had transformed themselves into efficient killers, their guns speaking with mathematical precision that devastated German positions. The future president was learning lessons about leadership and responsibility that would serve him well in years to come. The German retreat was conducted with typical Teutonic efficiency, but even the most organized withdrawal could not disguise the reality of defeat. Ammunition dumps were blown up, supply lines were severed, and defensive positions were abandoned after token resistance. The army that had terrorized Europe for 4 years was transforming into something resembling an armed mob. Lieutenant Colonel George Patton pressed his tank attacks with characteristic aggressiveness, despite mechanical problems that left half his armored vehicles stranded behind the advancing lines. His remaining tanks served more as mobile bunkers than breakthrough weapons, but their psychological effect on German morale remained significant. Enemy soldiers who had never seen these mechanical monsters often fled at their approach. The American air superiority had become so complete that German reconnaissance flights were virtually impossible. Captain Eddie Rickenbacker and his fellow pilots roamed the skies above the battlefield with impunity, strafing German positions and gathering intelligence that kept American commanders informed of enemy movements. The German Air Force, once the terror of Allied pilots, had been reduced to scattered squadrons barely capable of defending their own airfields. Major Charles Whittlesey, commanding a fresh battalion after his lost battalion ordeal, led the pursuit of retreating German forces with the grim determination of a man who had looked death in the face and survived. His tactical experience, bought with blood in the Argonne forest, made him one of the most effective battalion commanders in the American Expeditionary Force. The civilian population of Germany was beginning to feel the effects of the FWMOA collapse. Food shortages, caused by the British naval blockade and the diversion of resources to the military, had reached critical levels. Industrial production was failing as raw materials became scarce and workers were conscripted for military service. The home front was cracking under the strain of total war, as documented in historian David Kennedy's Over Here, The First World War in American Society. German prisoners taken during this phase of the battle reported widespread demoralization and talk of revolution among both military and civilian populations. Sergeant Alvin York, now promoted and decorated for his heroic actions, found himself assigned to training duties as American commanders sought to share his tactical expertise with newly arrived units. His mountain man's approach to warfare is emphasizing marksmanship and individual initiative. This became a model for American small unit tactics. The German High Command began secret negotiations through neutral countries, seeking a way to end the war. Before complete military collapse made honorable terms impossible, the specter of revolution, already visible in Russia, haunted German leaders who understood that military defeat could trigger the overthrow of the entire German political system. By November 1st, American forces had advanced over 30 miles from their starting positions, breaking through defensive lines that the Germans had considered impregnable. The cost had been enormous, over 26,000 American dead and wounded, but the strategic results were undeniable. The German army was in full retreat, its defensive capabilities shattered beyond repair. November 11, 1918, dawned gray and cold over the Argonne forest. At 11 o'clock that morning, the guns would fall silent for the first time in over 4 years. But until that moment, men continued to die for causes that had already been decided by diplomats in distant capitals. The final hours of the Great War proved as deadly as any that had preceded them. Captain Harry Truman received the ceasefire order at his artillery position near Verdun, but not before firing his battery's final salvos at German positions across the Meuse River. Years later, as President of the United States, he would remember this moment as the end of his innocence and the beginning of his understanding of the terrible burden of command. The Missouri farm boy had become a leader of men through the crucible of modern warfare. Lieutenant Colonel George Patton sat in his disabled tank, contemplating a war that had ended just as he was learning to fight it effectively. The armored warfare pioneer understood that this conflict had merely been a preview of future battles where machines would play an even more decisive role. His theories about tank tactics, developed in the mud of the Argonne, would eventually reshape military doctrine across the world. The German retreat had become a rout in all but name. Oberst Heinrich Müller struggled to maintain discipline among his demoralized troops as they abandoned position after position to the relentless American advance. The once proud German army was dissolving before his eyes, its soldiers more concerned with survival than duty. Many were simply walking away from their units, beginning the long journey home to an uncertain future. Captain Eddie Rickenbacker flew his final combat mission of the war just hours before the Armistice took effect. The American ace patrolled the skies above the Argonne one last time, observing the streams of German soldiers retreating toward their homeland. His war had been fought in 3 dimensions, where individual skill and courage mattered more than mass production. But he understood that even aerial warfare was becoming industrialized. Major Charles Whittlesey stood with his men as the ceasefire took effect, watching German soldiers emerge from their trenches with white flags and expressions of relief. The officer who had led the lost battalion through 5 days of hell now found himself supervising the peaceful surrender of men who had been trying to kill him just hours before. The absurdity of warfare had never been more apparent. Sergeant Alvin York returned to his Tennessee mountains as the most famous American soldier of the war. But fame could not erase the memories of friends lost in the Argonne forest. The marksman, who had single-handedly captured over 100 German soldiers, struggled to reconcile his Christian faith with the necessities of warfare. His post-war life would be dedicated to education and peace, a living reminder of the cost of conflict. The casualty figures from the Meuse Argonne offensive told the story in stark statistical terms: over 26,000 American dead, 1,000 wounded, and 14,000 missing. German losses were even higher, but more significantly, their army's capacity to continue fighting had been completely destroyed. The offensive had achieved its strategic objective of making continued German resistance impossible. According to the official final report of General John J. Pershing submitted to the Secretary of War, the Meuse Argonne offensive involved more American troops than any other battle in the nation's history and directly contributed to Germany's decision to seek an armistice. The armistice signed in Marshall Foch's railroad car in the Compiègne forest was not a peace treaty, but merely a cessation of hostilities. The terms were harsh, requiring German withdrawal from all occupied territories, the surrender of military equipment, and the maintenance of the Allied blockade until a formal peace treaty could be negotiated. Germany had no choice but to accept Exactly 11 o'clock on November 11th, 1918. The guns fell silent across the Western Front. The Great War, which had consumed an entire generation of European youth and drawn America into its first global conflict, was finally over. The Meuse-Argonne offensive had proven to be the final battle that made continued German resistance impossible, justifying General Pershing's insistence on maintaining an independent American command. The soldiers who survived would carry the memories of the Argonne Forest for the rest of their lives. They'd witnessed the birth of modern warfare and the death of the old world order. Their children would fight an even more terrible war just 20 years later. But the lessons learned in the mud and blood of the Argonne would help shape the American military doctrine that would eventually win that conflict as well. The Meuse-Argonne offensive had indeed been the final battle that made Armistice inevitable, breaking the back of German resistance and bringing the Great War to its conclusion. The price paid in American blood had purchased not just victory, but America's emergence as a global power that would shape the 20th century